court in Iowa once ordered a 15-year-old girl to pay $150,000 to the family of the grown man who had assaulted her. She finally fought back and ended his life. She was the victim. The law made her the debtor. The same story has played out over and over. Across the United States, England, Sudan, and Iran, across decades it keeps repeating. A girl is groomed, sold, hurt, forced into a marriage she never chose. She breaks or she defends herself, and a man dies. Then, the system that failed to protect her treats the child as the dangerous one, while the men who harmed her often answer for nothing at all. These are 10 of those girls. 10 children, the youngest just 14, pushed to a breaking point no child should ever reach, separated by oceans and decades. Their cases line up into a single, repeating picture of who the world chooses to punish and who it lets walk free. Section 1. Cyntoia Brown, the case that woke people up. In the summer of 2004, a girl named Cyntoia Brown was 16 years old and stuck inside a life that almost no adult around her seemed willing to stop. She lived in Nashville, Tennessee. She was not living safely with a family. She was living under the control of a grown man who went by the street name Cutthroat. He was in his early 20s, around 24. He did not treat her like a child or even like a person. He sold her to other men and kept the money for himself. He hurt her when she did not do what he wanted. He was violent enough that she once lost consciousness at his hands. He told her plainly that if she ever tried to leave him, he would end her life. So by the age of 16, Cyntoia had already learned a lesson that no kid should ever have to learn, which is that the grown-ups who were supposed to keep her safe were the ones doing the most damage. It is worth holding on to that man for a moment because of what later happened to him. He was the single person most responsible for the world Cyntoia was trapped in. He was the one selling her, threatening her, and beating her. And he died in 2005, before Cyntoia was ever sentenced. Means the adult who had turned a child into something to be sold never sat in a courtroom and answered for any of it. Full weight of the law landed on the 16-year-old. The man who created the nightmare around her slipped out of the story without ever facing judge. That imbalance, the child punished and the grown predator escaping, is a pattern that shows up again and again across these stories. It starts right here. To understand her story, the first thing to hold on to is her age, 16. Old enough to drive in most states, too young to vote, to rent a room, to sign most papers on her own. A 10th or 11th grader, the kind of person the law usually treats as a child who still needs looking after. That detail matters more than any other in the whole story, and it keeps coming back later in ways that are hard to forget. On the night that changed everything, Cyntoia was picked up by a man named Johnny Allen. He was 43 years old. He worked selling houses for a living. He met her at a Sonic drive-in restaurant and paid to take her back to his home. So the very thing that brought them together was already a crime, because she was a child and he was a grown man paying for her. He took her to his house, and somewhere in the hours that followed, she used a gun and he died. What happened in that room is the part people have argued about ever since. Cyntoia said she'd grown frightened. She said the man had a lot of guns in the house and was acting in a way that scared her. She said she believed he was reaching for a weapon and that she acted because she thought he was about to hurt her. The people who put her on trial told a very different version, Post. They pointed out that he had been harmed from behind while lying down, which did not fit a face-to-face struggle. They said she took some of his money and 2 of his guns and drove off in his truck afterward. They argued that the real reason she did it was robbery. Those 2 stories came out of the same night. The gap between them is the reason her case stayed so hard to settle for so many years. Then came the part that turned a sad story into something that made people genuinely angry once they understood it. Cyntoia was arrested, and even though she was 16, the state of Tennessee chose to put her on trial as an adult. In 2006, a jury found her guilty of the most serious charge for causing a death, along with robbery. The punishment was a life sentence. Under the rules in Tennessee, a life sentence meant she would not even be allowed to ask to leave prison until she had served 51 years. Think about what that number does to a 16-year-old. She would be around 67 years old before she could so much as request her freedom. Child went into a courtroom, and a courtroom decided she would most likely spend the rest of her life behind bars and grow old there. There is a piece of the law worth pausing on, because it shows how a sentence this harsh could be handed to a child and still be considered allowed. The highest court in the United States had said that locking children up for life with no chance of release was wrong, and that young people are different from adults and deserve a path back. Tennessee got around that by pointing to the 51-year rule. On paper, Cyntoia did have a chance at parole, so the state argued her sentence followed the rules. Catch was that the chance would not arrive until she was an old woman. The law could look at a 16-year-old facing 51 years in a cell and call it a sentence with hope built in, to anyone looking at it as a human being rather than a rulebook. 51 years was not hope, it was a life. There was also a piece of her history that the jury at her trial never got to weigh properly, and it changes how a fair person reads everything. Cyntoia's mother had drunk heavily while she was pregnant. That heavy drinking had harmed the way Cyntoia's brain developed before she was ever born. It made it harder for her to think things through, to control her actions, to judge danger the way most people do. This was not an excuse someone invented for her later. It was a real, measurable thing about how her mind worked, and it had been there her entire life. Years after her trial, when her lawyers dug deeper and her case came up for review, that damage became clearer. And her mother acknowledged how much she had been drinking while pregnant. People who decided her future in 2006 made that decision without ever fully seeing it. They judged a teenager whose brain had been hurt before birth as if she were a grown adult thinking with a clear, healthy mind. For a long time after that, nothing moved. Cyntoia sat in prison. The world went on without her. Teenager who had been bought and sold and hurt was now simply a number in a cell, and the loudest message her own country had sent her was that she was the dangerous one in the story. That is the quiet horror at the centre of her case. A child was treated as a product by grown men, and when she finally struck back inside that nightmare, the law treated her as a cold adult criminal, and the men around her mostly walked away. The thing that slowly pulled her case back into the light was attention from people far outside the courtroom. Pratt. In 2011, a documentary film about her life reached a wider audience and laid out the full shape of what had happened to her. Filmmaker had followed her for years, which meant viewers did not just see a mugshot and a charge. They saw a child grow up inside a broken system, and they saw the damage that had been done to her long before that night. The film showed the girl in the news clip had been a victim of exploitation long before she was ever a defendant. The word for it means a person was bought, sold, and used by someone controlling them. For a child, it is one of the worst things that can be done to them. Once people saw that Cyntoia fit that description exactly, case started to look very different from the way it had first been reported. Years later, the attention grew enormous, and the timing mattered. Around 2017, the country was in the middle of a larger reckoning about how women and girls are treated. How often stories are ignored, how rarely the powerful men who harm them face consequences. That conversation was everywhere, and Cyntoia's case fit into it perfectly. Famous people with millions of followers began posting about her. The singer Rihanna shared her story and questioned out loud whether the meaning of justice had quietly changed in a post that spread to millions of people. Kim Kardashian, who was becoming an advocate for fixing the justice system, spoke up too. Other public figures, lawmakers, and a member of Congress added their voices. Hashtag spread across the internet, built around the simple idea of setting Cyntoia free. Suddenly, a case that had been buried for over a decade was on phones and television screens all over the country. People who had never heard her name were now asking a hard question out loud, which was how a child who had been sold to men had ended up serving a life sentence, while the system seemed to have so little to say about the men who used her. In January of 2019, the pressure finally met power. The governor of Tennessee at the time, Bill Haslam, used his authority to cut her sentence short. He did not pretend that nothing had happened. He called it a tragic and complicated case, and he was honest that a man had lost his life. But he also said that forcing a person who had committed a crime at 16 to wait 51 years for a chance at freedom was simply too harsh, especially given how hard she had worked to change herself while locked up. On August 7, 2019, Cyntoia Brown walked out of prison. She had served 15 years. She was around 31 years old. She would stay under close supervision and strict rules for 10 more years, including holding a job and going to counselling. But she was out. What she did with that freedom matters as much as the freedom itself. She did not vanish. She married, and she began going by the name Cyntoia Brown Long. She wrote a book about her life. She started speaking publicly, telling her story, so that people would understand how a child ends up where she ended up, host, and so that other young girls being sold and used might be seen as victims instead of criminals. A teenager who had once been treated as a throwaway became a grown woman determined to use the worst years of her life to help others. That turn, from a number in a cell to a voice people listen to, is part of why her case stuck in the public memory. The deeper reason her case landed so hard on people has to do with how it scrambled the usual picture of who is a victim and who is a criminal. Most people grow up believing those are two separate groups of people. There are the people things happen to. There are the people who do bad things, and the two do not overlap. Cyntoia's life broke that idea wide open. She was a victim, and she had taken a life. Both were true at the same time. A court had only been able to see one of those two facts, and it had picked the one that put a teenager away for life. Watching that play out forced a lot of people to admit that the line between victim and offender is far blurrier than they wanted it to be, especially when the offender is a frightened, damaged child who was already being treated as someone else's property. Her release did more than free one person. It helped push lawmakers to look again at how exploited kids are handled when they end up in the legal system. The idea spreading out of her case was a simple one. A child who is being sold and abused should not be treated as a hardened adult criminal the moment they fight back or break, because the abuse came first and the child never chose any of it. Cyntoia Brown became the face of that idea. For a lot of people, hers was the first time they had ever truly understood that a teenage girl could be both the person harmed and the person who took a life, and that the system around her could get the whole thing badly wrong. It is worth sitting with how close her story came to having no second chapter. If a film had never been made, if famous strangers had never posted, a governor had never decided to act in his final weeks in office, Cyntoia would still be sitting in a cell right now, decades away from even asking to leave. Her freedom did not come because the courts realized their mistake on their own. Came because enough ordinary people outside the system refused to let her be forgotten. That is a hopeful thought, and a frightening one at the same time, because it means the rescue depended on luck and noise, rather than on the law, working the way it should. For every Cyntoia whose name reached a singer with millions of followers, there are others whose names never travelled past a courtroom, and whose sentences are still quietly running right now. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously, and here is the part that makes her case the right place to begin. When Cyntoia walked free in 2019, a lot of the country treated it as a brand new kind of story, something it had never seen before. A 16-year-old, exploited and afraid, punished for life, finally saved. People spoke about it as a first. The truth is that the same heartbreaking thing had already happened to another 16-year-old girl on the opposite side of the country. Many years earlier, in a case that looked almost like a mirror of Cyntoia's. The difference is that when it happened to her, almost no one came running. That earlier girl is where we go next. Section 2, Sarah Kruzan, 16 and sold. The girl had a name, Sarah Kruzan. She grew up in Riverside, California, which sits a little inland from Los Angeles. Her story began long before the night anyone ever heard about. To really understand what happened to her, the clock has to be turned back much further than that night. All the way back to when she was a small child, because the man whose life she would one day take had been circling her world since she was 11 years old. His name was George Gilbert Howard. When Sarah first met him, he was a grown man in his late 20s or so, and she was a kid. He did not show up in her life looking like a danger. That is the cruelest part, and it is the part that makes her story so important to understand. He came across as kind. He paid attention to her. He acted like the caring older figure that a lonely child wants more than almost anything. Sarah did not have a steady, safe home life. Howard slipped into the empty space where a protective adult should have been. He gave her the feeling of being looked after. He earned her trust slowly, over time, the way these men almost always do. That slow earning of trust has a name that people understand better now than they did back then. It is called grooming. Grooming is when an adult spends months or years being nice to a child on purpose, building closeness and trust, so that later they can take advantage of that child. And the child will be too confused or too attached to fight back or tell anyone. It is patient, planned, and it works because a child cannot see the trap while they are standing inside it. By the time the kindness turns into something else, the child often believes the person harming them is the only one who loves them. For Sarah, the turn came around the age of 13. The man who had spent years being her friend and protector began abusing her. Then he went further. He started selling her to other men and keeping the money. The same horror that sat at the centre of Cyntoia Brown's life. Plain word for it is exploitation, which means a person is bought, sold, and used by someone who controls them. Sarah was 13 years old when this began. She was a middle schooler. The man steering all of it was the same man she had once seen as the closest thing she had to a real parent. So by the time Sarah was 16, she had spent years inside that life. Years of being used, years of being sold, years of a single grown man owning her days and her body and her sense of what she was even worth. Children who live through that for long enough often stop being able to imagine any other kind of life because the abuse becomes the only world they know. Their fear and their loyalty and their pain all get tangled together until they can barely tell one from another. In 1994, when Sarah was 16, The years of all that built to a single night in a motel room. Sarah said that Howard tried to force himself on her again that night, and in that room she used a gun and he died. Afterward, she took $1,500 in cash and left in his car, a sporty vehicle, and drove away from the scene. What the law did with that night is the heart of why Sarah's name is in this story at all. She was 16 when it happened. By the time she stood trial in 1995, she was 17. And the state of California chose to try her as an adult, exactly the way Tennessee would later treat Cyntoia. A jury found her guilty of a planned, intentional act that had caused a death, gravest finding short of the loss of her own life. The punishment they handed a 17-year-old was the heaviest one short of that, life without the possibility of parole. Those last 4 words deserve to be slowed down because most people hear them and do not feel their full weight. Life without the possibility of parole means there is no door, there is no future hearing, no chance to one day show how you have changed, no number of years after which you can ask to go home. It means a person is meant to stay locked in prison until the day they die, with no exit written into the sentence at all. A 17-year-old girl who had been groomed since she was 11 and sold since she was 13 was told by a courtroom that her life was effectively over and that she would spend every remaining day of it behind bars. Even some of the people inside that courtroom seemed uneasy about what had just been done. After the sentence came down, members of the jury spoke up to say they were upset because the full story of the abuse Sarah had lived through had not been laid in front of them the way it should have been. The judge himself made a remark suggesting the sentence felt awfully severe for someone so young, given the evidence of what her abuser had done to her. The discomfort was right there in the room. And still the sentence stood. Child was sent away forever. And the machine simply moved on to the next case. Doctors, who later studied Sarah, described something that helps explain why a teenager would stay near the very person destroying her, and why fear and breaking point can finally collide. They pointed to what builds up inside a person who is abused over and over for years on end. The constant fear rewires how a person thinks. It teaches them that danger is always close, that escape is impossible. Fighting back will only bring worse pain. It wears down the part of the mind that believes things can ever be different. By the time Sarah reached that motel room, she was not a calm person making a clear, simple choice. She was a teenager carrying years of damage that no one had ever helped her heal. The contrast with Cyntoia's story is impossible to miss, and it is the reason Sarah comes right after her here. The 2 cases look almost like reflections of each other. Both girls were 16, both were groomed and sold by older men. Both took a man's life, took money and a vehicle, and drove off. Both were tried as adults and handed sentences meant to keep them locked away for life or close to it. The lives ran along nearly the same terrible path. The difference is in who came to help and when. Cyntoia's case eventually exploded across the whole country, carried by famous voices and millions of strangers. When the same thing happened to Sarah years earlier, the world mostly looked away. There was no flood of celebrity posts. There was no hashtag rushing across grave phones. For a long, long time, there was just a girl in a cell that the system intended to be her grave. Help did come for Sarah, but it came slowly, and it took the unusual involvement of not 1 but 3 different governors of California across more than a decade. The first step happened in December of 2010. Arnold Schwarzenegger, who was the governor at the time and was about to leave office, used his power to change her sentence. He did not erase what happened. He shortened the punishment from life without any chance of release to 5 years to life, which finally put a door into a sentence that had not had one. That single act meant Sarah could one day ask to be set free, instead of being told the answer was no forever. The second step came in 2013. By then, Sartor had been sentenced again, this time to a lighter form of the conviction, with the total amount of time bringing her close to release given everything she had already served. The governor then was Jerry Brown, and under his watch, Sarah was allowed to leave prison. She walked out after serving 18 years, gone in as a teenager and come out as a grown woman in her 30s, having spent more than half her life so far behind bars for something she did at 16 while trapped inside a nightmare that adults had built around her. The third and final step came years later, in July of 2022. Governor Gavin Newsom granted Sarah a pardon. Pardon is an official act of forgiveness from the government. It does not pretend the crime never happened, and it does not bring the man back. What it does is formally recognise that the person has earned a clean slate going forward, and it lifts a great deal of the weight that a conviction keeps pressing on someone for the rest of their life. In his written reasons, was careful to say that forgiving Sarah did not undo the harm of that night or make it small. He framed it instead as honouring the enormous work she had done to rebuild herself into someone new. So, between 2010 and 2022, 3 governors from different times, each looked at the same young woman and each decided, in their own way, that the original sentence had been far too cruel. Sarah's case spent years buried in the dark. What finally pulled it into the light was a video, a human rights organisation that studies how young people are treated by courts around the world, made a short film about Sarah and a handful of other people who had been sentenced as children to spend their whole lives in prison. The film told her story plainly: a girl groomed at 11, sold at 13, and locked away for life at 17. It was put online, and it spread. People who watched it could not square the calm, thoughtful young woman on the screen with the idea that she deserved to spend the rest of her life behind bars. Strangers began to learn her name for the first time in years. The world started paying attention to a case it had ignored when it happened. As the years passed, the campaign around her grew, drawing in well-known supporters from the world of film and a steady stream of strangers who wrote letters and signed their names demanding a second look at her case. That attention reached people with the power to act. A state lawmaker took up Sarah's case and used it as the human face of a larger fight. He pushed for a new law in California, one built on a simple idea: that a person sentenced as a child to life with no chance of release should at least be able to come back before a judge years later and show how they had changed. The law reached far beyond Sarah herself. It gave every child who had been handed a sentence built to erase them a chance to come back years later and be seen as the person they had become. Sarah's story was the one that helped move it, which means a teenager who had been thrown away helped build a door that other thrown-away kids one day walk through. There was also a piece of her trial worth returning to, because it shows what the jury was working with during the proceedings. An expert who studied the minds of abuse survivors explained what years of being controlled and sold does to a young person. The expert described how that kind of long abuse rewires a child, teaching them that they cannot escape and that danger is always near. It was the closest the court came to understanding in some way Sarah had not simply walked away from Howard long before that night. Walking away is something a free person can imagine. A child who has been owned since she was 13 often cannot. The testimony was there, and the sentence came down anyway, which shows how little weight that understanding carried in 1995. What Sarah did with her freedom is the part of her story that turns it from a tragedy into something with a little light in it. she did not disappear quietly. She became a voice. She spoke out against the practice of sentencing children to life without any chance of release, arguing that no matter what a kid has done, a child is not the same as the adult they might grow into, and the law should leave room for them to change. She also became an advocate for other people who had been exploited, especially young girls, caught in the same trap that had swallowed her. The teenager who had once been sold and then thrown away was now standing in front of lawmakers and crowds, using the worst years of her life to try to spare other children from the same fate. Even a state lawmaker had used her case while pushing for fairer treatment of young people in the courts. Her case, like Cyntoia's, forces a hard look at the same uncomfortable truth about who gets called a victim and who gets called a criminal. Sarah was, without any doubt, dumb. She was groomed at 11 and sold at 13 by a grown man who had spent years preparing to use her. But she was also the person who acted that night. The courtroom that judged her in 1995 was only able to fix its eyes on the second of those facts, punished her as if the first one barely existed. The men who buy and sell children rarely face anything close to a life sentence. The child who finally breaks under all of it was handed one without blinking. That imbalance is the thing Sarah spent her freedom trying to make people see. Honesty matters here, the same way it did with Cyntoia Host, because her case was never as simple as a girl facing an attacker in the middle of a struggle. People who prosecuted her argued that by the time of that night, Sarah was no longer being controlled by Howard. They used that to claim her actions were not pure, in the moment, self-defense. Sarah's side described a teenager so broken by years of abuse, so freshly attacked that night, that her actions cannot be judged the way you would judge a calm adult stranger. Both of those descriptions have been argued seriously by serious people. Holding them at the same time is the only fair way to tell what happened. Real victim did a terrible thing, and the exact shape of it has been debated ever since. There is one more reason Sarah's story sits where it does. She and Cyntoia were taken over by men who started as outsiders. A stranger wormed his way in, earned trust, and then turned into a captor. The danger walked into their lives from the world beyond their front doors. That detail makes it a little easier for some people to keep the horror at arm's length, because it lets them imagine the threat as something that comes from out there, from bad strangers, from a dark corner of the city that good families never have to enter. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next girl in this story tears that comfort away completely. She was younger than both Sarah and Cyntoia, just 14 years old. And the person she feared was not a stranger who had crept into her life from somewhere outside. He had been there from the very beginning. He lived in her house, sat at her table, and shared her last name. Section 3, Brescia Meadows. The youngest of them all, his name was Jonathan Meadows, and he was her father. He was 41 years old, and he lived in Warren, Ohio, a town about an hour southeast of Cleveland. He shared a home with his wife and his children. From the outside, it would have looked like an ordinary family in an ordinary house. The girl who would one day end his life was his own daughter, Brescia. She was 14 years old. She was the youngest of all the girls in this story, young enough that most people would still call her a little kid, and the person she was most afraid of in the entire world was sleeping under the same roof every single night. The family that lived inside that house tells a story about Jonathan that is hard to read. According to his wife, Brandy, and to other relatives, he was a violent man at home, and he had been for years. They described severe harm done to his wife, injuries serious enough to be lasting, the result of years of being hurt by him. He kept the family in a state of constant fear. He had a gun, and according to them, he used the threat of it to keep everyone in line. The children grew up watching their mother be hurt, learning early that the man at the head of the table was someone to be feared rather than someone who kept them safe. For Brescia, fear did not stay quiet inside her. It came out in the ways that pain often comes out of a child who has no safe person to tell. She began to sink into deep distress. She started running away from home in her early teens, slipping out of a house that was supposed to be her shelter. Because the shelter itself was the danger, fought. About 2 months before the night everything ended, she ran away again, and this time she went to the home of her aunt. She told relatives that she was scared for her life. She said her father was hurting her mother and threatening to harm the whole family. What? She was a young teenager begging the adults around her to understand that her home was not safe. And she was doing it the only way a frightened kid knows how, by trying to get out. Those relatives was in a position to know exactly how serious that kind of fear can be. Brescia's aunt, Sherry Latessa, worked as a police detective, and her focus was on cases of harm inside families. She had spent her career dealing with exactly this kind of situation. By her own account, part of the reason she went into that line of work was what she had watched happening inside her own sister's family, Brescia. So when Brescia'd up frightened and talking about a father who hurt and threatened them, she was not talking to a stranger who could brush it off. She was talking to a trained adult whose entire job was understanding when a home had become a trap. And even with that aunt in her corner, the danger did not stop. Then came the early morning of July 28, 2016. Jonathan Meadows was asleep in the living room. His wife was sleeping on the floor nearby. Brescia, 14 years old, took her father's own gun and used it while he slept, and he died there in the home. A child had ended her father's life in the one place a child is always told they are supposed to feel safest. Fact that he was asleep is the single most important and most difficult detail in her entire case, and it cannot be skipped over or softened. No struggle that night. There was no moment where he was lunging at her, and she acted to stop him. He was lying down, unaware, defenseless. 14-year-old ended his life. That is the truth, and it is the truth that pulls her story in two different directions depending on who is telling it. On one side stand Brescia's mother and the relatives who lived through years of that household. The way they see it, a child who is small and powerless against a large, violent, armed adult does not get a fair fight. Kid cannot win a physical battle against a grown man who terrorizes the family. They argue that for someone in Brescia's position, the only moment she could ever act safely against a man who frightened. Everyone was a moment when he could not immediately turn that violence back on her or her mother. In their telling, she was not a cold criminal. She was a desperate child who believed years of fear, and after running away and finding no rescue, that this was the only way to keep herself and her mother alive. Her mother went so far as to call her a hero. On the other side stand the people who push back hard on that picture. Some of Jonathan's own relatives flatly denied that any abuse ever happened. His sister insisted there were no signs of it. She described what Brescia did as cold and planned, rather than the act of a cornered child. Early on, even the local prosecutor said that he had not found evidence of the abuse the family was describing. From that point of view, a man lost his life while he slept and could not defend himself. And that is a serious thing, no matter what was said about him afterward. Both of these versions belong in the story. A family described years of terror, and a man lost his life in his sleep, and the distance between those two facts is the reason her case was never simple. What happened next put a different kind of fear into the people watching because the question quickly became how the law would treat a 14-year-old. In Ohio, children as young as 14 can be moved out of the court system meant for kids and tried in the same courts as grown adults. Brescia was first charged with the most serious charge the state has, and for months it was genuinely unclear which path her case would take. She had been tried as an adult and found guilty. She could have ended up as one of the youngest people inside Ohio's adult prison system, child surrounded by grown prisoners, possibly for decades. The thought of a 14-year-old being funneled into adult prison for a case rooted in years of harm at home struck a lot of people as deeply wrong. That fear is what built a movement around her. Supporters across the country organised under a simple banner, a campaign to free Brescia. They ran letter-writing drives aimed at the people deciding her future. They gathered books to send to her while she sat locked up. They started a petition demanding her release. They raised money for her family, eventually pulling in more than $150,000. People who had never met this girl in Ohio decided that the idea of a traumatized 14-year-old being treated as a hardened adult was something they could not stay silent about. The pressure was real, and it was loud, and it was aimed squarely at keeping a child out of an adult cage. Slowly, the case began to bend away from the harshest outcome. In December of 2016, prosecutors announced that Brescia would stay in the court system meant for young people rather than being tried as an adult. That decision mattered enormously because it meant the worst possibilities, the ones that ended with a child spending much of her life among adult prisoners, were now off the table. The following spring, in May of 2017, case was settled with a deal. The most serious charge was dropped. In its place, she admitted to a far lesser one, kind used when a death is caused without it being planned. In the youth court system, the version of admitting guilt is to enter a plea of true, that is what she did. The terms of that deal show how far the case had travelled from where it started. By the time it was reached, Brescia had already been locked up for around 10 months. The agreement set her total time at roughly a year and a half. Instead of more time in a plain, locked detention centre, she was moved to a treatment centre, a place focused on mental health, where she would spend about 6 months getting therapy for everything she had lived through, and everything she had done. The deal also arranged for her record to be sealed when she turned 21, which meant she could walk into adulthood without this following her around, like a shadow for the rest of her life. Her lawyer pointed out how staggering the change was, given that the case had begun with the possibility of her spending her life in prison. In early February of 2018, Brescia Meadows went home. She was released to her family with 2 years of probation, which is a kind of supervised freedom, where a person stays out of a locked facility, but has to follow strict rules and check in regularly, the threat of being locked back up if they slip. By the time she walked out, she was 16 years old, the same age Cyntoia and Sarah had been on their worst nights. Except Brescia had reached it on the other side of her case, walking back into a home and a life, rather than disappearing into a prison sentence meant to last forever. The reason her story belongs right here, after the 2 girls who were sold by men from outside their families, is that it strips away a comfort those earlier cases still allowed. Cyntoia and Sarah, the danger came from out there, from the streets, from a stranger who slithered into their lives. A person could hear those stories and quietly tell themselves that this kind of horror happens somewhere else, to other families, far from their own front door. Brescia's case ends that idea. The danger she lived with was not a stranger. It was the man whose last name she carried, who lived in her house and slept on her couch. The threat had been there since the day she was born. For a lot of people, that is far more frightening than any stranger, because it means the harm can be coming from inside, the very place a child is told is safest, and no one on the outside may ever see it. Her case also reshapes the question that runs underneath this entire story, the question of who counts as a victim and who counts as a criminal. With Brescia, the people who were closest to the situation, including a relative whose job was literally studying harm inside families, described a child who had been worn down by years of fear in her own home. The court system, after months of pressure and a long, hard look, ultimately chose not to treat her as an adult offender. It chose treatment and a sealed record and a path back to her family over a cage. That choice did not erase the difficult truth that a man lost his life while he slept. What it did was recognize that a 14-year-old shaped by years of harm at home is not the same as a grown stranger who takes a life in cold blood, and that punishing the child as if she were that stranger would have been its own kind of cruelty. For there is something almost hopeful buried in how Brescia's case ended, at least compared to the life sentences that nearly swallowed the girls before her. A court looked at a child who had ended a life and decided that locking her away forever was not the answer. It decided she needed help more than she needed punishment, and it let her go home. That outcome can make it seem like the system, pushed hard enough, is capable of choosing mercy for a young girl caught in an impossible situation. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next girl in this story shows the limit of that mercy in a way that is genuinely hard to believe. She was also a teenager. She was also a victim, sold and abused like Cyntoia and Sara before her. And when her case ended, the court did spare her from prison, much like Brescia, but then it did something else. Something that left people around the world stunned. It handed her a bill, a demand for a large sum of money, and it told her she owed it to the family of the very man who had died at her hands. Section 4. Pippa Lewis. The bill for staying alive. A court told a teenage girl that she owed money to the family of the man who had assaulted her. Not a small amount either. $150,000. She was a victim of exploitation, a child who had been sold to men, and after she ended the life of the grown man who had been hurting her, the legal system spared her from prison and then turned around and handed her that bill. The girl was named Pippa Lewis, and her case in Des Moines, Iowa, became one of the clearest examples there is of how the law can wound a victim a second time, long after the danger is gone. Her story begins, like so many of these do, with a child who had nowhere safe to be. Pippa was 15 years old. She had run away from home, away from an adoptive mother she said was abusive, and she had ended up with no real place to live. Running was not a one-time thing for her. She ran more than once, the way kids do when home is the thing they are fleeing rather than the thing they are missing. For a while she was sleeping in the hallways of an apartment building in Des Moines, a kid with no bed and no door to lock, trying to get through each night. A 15-year-old should be worrying about homework and friends. Pippa was worrying about where she would sleep and whether she would be safe while she did it. Into that empty, frightening space stepped a man in his late 20s. He took her in, he gave her a place to stay, and acted at first like someone who cared about her. He even presented himself as her boyfriend, which made the trap harder to see, because a scared and lonely teenager wants to believe that someone has finally chosen to look after her. The same trap that closed around Cyntoia and Sara closed around Pippa too. The shelter came with a price she never agreed to. The man who took her in began selling her to other men, exploiting her the way grown men had exploited the girls before her. Child with no home was now a child being passed around for money, controlled by an adult who had pretended to rescue her. One of the men she was sold to was named Zachary Brooks. He was 37 years old. According to Pieper, Brooks forced himself on her repeatedly in the weeks leading up to his death, several separate times. She said she had been forced, point of a knife, to go to his apartment so that he could use her. So by the time her story reached its breaking point, she was a 15-year-old who had been homeless, then taken in and sold, then handed over again and again to a grown man more than 20 years older than her, who treated her body as something he had paid for. The breaking point came on June 1, 2020. Pieper said that after Brooks assaulted her again, something in her snapped. She grabbed a knife from beside the bed and used it on him. She did not use it only once. She struck him many times and he died. Afterward, she showered and she drove away in one of his cars. By her own account, she had been overcome with rage in that moment, acting without a plan, drowning in everything that had been done to her. The exact circumstances of that moment became one of the contested parts of her case. Honesty requires laying both sides out. Pieper described realizing that Brooks had assaulted her yet again, and then grabbing the knife in a flood, fury and fear. The people who prosecuted her saw it differently in one key way. They argued that Brooks was asleep at the time, which would mean he was not an immediate threat to her in that exact instant. The number of wounds, far more than one, also sat heavily over the case. Here is the part that matters most for understanding what came later. The police and prosecutors did not deny the worst of it. They did not dispute that Pieper had been assaulted. They did not dispute that she had been sold and exploited. Those facts were accepted. The fight was over how to judge what she did inside that horror. Not over whether the horror was real. She was first charged with the most serious charge the state had, the kind reserved for a planned act that ends a life. As her case moved forward, she reached a deal. In 2021, she admitted to 2 lesser charges instead. One was the charge used when someone causes a death without it being planned. The other was for badly hurting someone on purpose. Each of those carried up to 10 years, which meant that together they could have sent her to prison for as long as 20 years. Then came the day of her sentencing in September of 2022, when she was 17, and the judge made a choice that surprised a lot of people in a good way before he made another one that horrified them. Judge David Porter decided to hold back the prison time. Instead of locking her up, he placed her on 5 years of closely supervised probation, which is a kind of monitored freedom with strict rules attached. He made clear that the 20 years of possible prison were not erased. They were hanging over her head, waiting, in case she broke the rules of her probation. But for the moment, she would not go to prison. After everything, the court chose not to cage her. That looked like mercy. The hearing where all of this happened was not gentle on her, though that is part of the story too. The judge pressed her hard, asking her to explain the poor choices she felt she had made that led to that night, kult, and he voiced concern about whether she would follow the rules placed on her. The people prosecuting her pushed back on the very idea of calling her a victim and argued that she had not fully taken responsibility for ending a man's life and leaving his children without a father. So even on the day, a court decided to spare her from prison. She sat through hours of being treated as someone who needed to account for her own survival. The mercy, such as it was, came wrapped in a great deal of blame. The mercy also did not last through the same hearing. Under Iowa law, anyone found responsible for causing a person's death has to pay a set sum of money to that person's family. The amount written into the law was $150,000, and it was not something the judge could lower or waive away based on the facts of who the man was or what he had done. The judge said plainly that he had no choice in the matter, that the law gave him no other option that the state's highest court had already upheld this rule. The rule was a flat one. It did not ask whether the dead person had been a good man or a monster. It did not ask whether the person paying had been a hardened criminal or a trafficked child defending herself. It simply set a number and demanded it be paid. So a girl who had been sold to men as a child, who had ended the life of the grown man who assaulted her, was ordered by a court to pay $150,000 to that man's family. The math of it was almost too ugly to believe. A victim now legally owed a fortune to the relatives of the person who had harmed her. When that detail reached the wider world, the reaction was loud and immediate. People across the country and beyond struggled to understand how a system could spare a teenager from prison, while in the very same breath forcing to hand a small fortune to the family of the man who had hurt her. To a lot of people, it felt like the law was punishing a child for surviving, putting a dollar figure on her own suffering and presenting her with the invoice. Decided they were not going to let that bill stand. An online fundraiser was started to cover the $150,000. It blew past the goal. People gave so much that the fundraiser collected more than double the amount she owed. Somewhere north of $350,000. Ordinary people once again stepped in to do what the system would not, pulling money out of their own pockets to lift a weight off a girl most of them would never meet. The same thing that had saved Cyntoia, the kindness and anger of strangers, was now paying off a debt that should never have existed. Her case did not end cleanly there. Pretending it did would not be honest. In the months after her sentencing, Pieper broke the rules of her probation. First, she removed the electronic monitor that had been locked around her ankle to track where she was, and in November she walked away from the women's centre where she had been placed, leaving without permission. Breaking probation in that way is exactly the kind of thing that can trigger the prison time a judge has been holding back. Her case returned to court in 2023, when she was 18, to decide what should happen. What happened next showed that the people running her case had not stopped seeing her as a human being. The county attorney, Kimberly Graham, did not push to throw her in prison. Instead, her office agreed that Pieper should stay on probation rather than be locked up. Graham said her office saw Pieper as a person, that she was someone at real risk of being harmed and used all over again, and that there was little chance she would harm anyone else. Witnesses, for her side, explained something that the public often does not understand, which is that children who survive this kind of exploitation are very likely to run, and that running is not a sign of a bad character, but a wound left by the trauma. These are kids whose bodies have learned that staying still is dangerous. Pulling off a monitor and slipping away is, for some of them, less a crime than a reflex carved in by years of needing to escape. Her side argued she needed care built around that trauma rather than punishment, treated her like a careless adult. The judge agreed to keep her on probation rather than sending her away. He did take something from her, though. Originally, the deal had carried a promise that if Pieper completed her probation cleanly, the whole thing would be wiped from her record, leaving her able to start adulthood without it trailing her. After she broke the rules, the judge took that promise back, told her that she had asked for a second chance and gotten it, and that a third was not coming, left her with 2 serious convictions that would stay on her record. So the girl who had been homeless at 15, sold and abused, walked out of all of it, still carrying a permanent mark from the night she fought back. Even after the court chose not to imprison her, the mark would follow her into job applications, into housing, into all the ordinary parts of an adult life that a record quietly closes off. Reason Pieper's case lands so hard, especially placed right after Brescia's, is the way it tests the idea of mercy. Brescia's story seemed to suggest that the system, when pushed, could choose kindness for a young girl in an impossible spot. It could pick treatment over a cage. Pieper's case takes that hope and complicates it in a way that is genuinely upsetting. The court did choose to keep her out of prison, which is real and matters. And yet the same court, bound by a law that could not tell the difference between a guilty offender and an exploited child defending herself, still found a way to make her pay. The mercy and the cruelty arrived in the same room, on the same day, from the same bench. That is the uncomfortable lesson buried in her story. Sparing a girl from prison is not the same as treating her fairly. The system can do the first while badly failing at the second. Her case also sharpens the question that keeps returning, the question of who the law decides is a victim and who it decides is something else. Everyone involved agreed. Pieper had been sold and assaulted. The label of victim was not in dispute the way it had been in some of the earlier cases, and still the law reached past all of that and treated her, in the matter of that $150,000, as simply the person responsible for a death, with the man who assaulted her recast as the wronged party whose family deserved to be paid. Child who was sold could be a victim and a debtor to the family of the man who harmed her at the same time, because that is what the rules on the books said. The rules did not bend for her humanity. People had to bend it for her instead, their own money and their own outrage. There is a thread that ties Pieper back to Cyntoia and Sarah that is worth holding on to. All three were victims of exploitation, children sold by grown men. All three ended the life of a man connected to that world of being bought and used. All three found that the law was slow, blunt, and often unable to see them clearly as the children they were. The difference in Pieper's case is the strange, specific shape the failure took. A price tag rather than a life sentence, but the deeper problem was the same. The law did not have a clear, ready way to understand a child who fights back inside the nightmare of being sold, used. So it reached for whatever rule was nearest and applied it. Even when applying it produced something that looked like a moral disaster. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. That gap, the law not knowing what to do with an exploited girl who fights back, is exactly the gap the next case tried to close. Because in another state, there actually was a law on the books, written for situations like this. It said that a person who had been sold and exploited could not be punished for things that situation had pushed them into. For the next girl, that law was a thread of real hope, a rule that might mean she could be found not guilty altogether. The enormous question her case forced into the open was whether a law like that could possibly stretch far enough to cover the ending of a life. Section 5. Crystal Kaiser. The law that almost didn't count. There was a law that seemed like it had been written for a girl exactly like Crystal Kaiser. It lived on the book in the state of Wisconsin, passed back in 2008. And it said something simple and powerful. Person who had been sold and exploited could not be blamed or punished for a crime if that crime came directly out of that exploitation. For a teenager who had been sold to men and then ended the life of the man selling her, that law looked like a door to freedom. Her case became a long, grinding fight over one enormous question, which was whether a law meant to protect victims could possibly stretch far enough to cover the ending of a life. The answer would take years to arrive, and even when it came, it did not save her the way people hoped. Crystal Kaiser was 17 years old when she ended the life of Randall Voller in Kenosha, Wisconsin, in June of 2018. To understand what brought her to that night, the clock goes back about a year. to when she was around 16. She met Vola through a website that was used to sell people. He was a grown man, 34 years old, more than twice her age. At first he did what these men so often do. He gave her gifts and attention, and made himself look like someone good in her life. Then, the truth of the arrangement set in. Over the months that followed, he abused her and sold her to other men, keeping the money for himself. Pattern by now is painfully familiar, the same one that swallowed Cyntoia and Sarah and Pippa. A grown man found a vulnerable young girl, used her, and treated her like something he owned. What sets Vola apart, and what makes Krystul's case so enraging, that the people who were supposed to stop him already knew exactly what he was. Before Krystul ever acted, police in Kenosha were investigating Vola for preying on underage girls. He had made homemade videos of himself abusing children, and there were close to 24 of them. Investigators came to believe he had harmed around a dozen young black girls in the area, some of them as young as 12. He had been taken into custody earlier that year, with all of that evidence sitting in front of the authorities, and then he had been let go, released without being held, while the investigation supposedly continued. He was a man facing the possibility of years in prison for what he had done to children, and he was walking around free in the meantime. Grown predator who had filmed himself harming kids was out in the world, and the girls he had hurt, including Krystul, were left to deal with him on their own. The system had a predator in its hands and opened its fingers. Everything that happened next flowed through that open hand. On June 5, 2018, Krystul went to Vola's home. She had a small gun with her, weapon her boyfriend had given her for protection. That night she used it and Vola died. She then set his house on fire and she left the scene in his BMW, taking some of his money and a laptop with her. Then Vola lost his life before he could ever be found guilty of anything in a courtroom, which means the children in those videos never got the answer a trial might have brought. A man who might have spent decades in prison for harming a dozen girls, instead, became, in the eyes of the law, a victim himself. The story of what actually happened in that house splits into two sharply different versions, and both have been argued with full seriousness. Krystul said it was self-defense. She described a man who had been abusing and selling her for a year, and she said that on that night he tried to touch her after she refused him, and that she feared what he would do. From her side, what she did was the desperate act of an exploited girl finally fighting the man who had been destroying her. The people who prosecuted her told a darker story. They argued it was planned ahead of time, that there was evidence she had thought it out in advance, and that part of the motive was simply to steal his car, pointed to things she did afterward, including posting on social media, and to statements just suggesting she was not afraid to act again. Fire she set, and the things she took were used to paint a picture of a calculated crime rather than a panicked one. These two versions cannot both be fully true, and the gap between them is the reason her case was so fiercely fought. Charges thrown at her matched the most serious version of events. She was charged with the gravest charge the state has, the kind meant for an intentional, planned act that ends a life, which on its own could carry a sentence of life in prison. On top of that came charges for setting the fire, for taking the car, and more. A 17-year-old was staring down to the possibility of spending the rest of her life behind bars, the same cliff that Cyntoia and Sarah had been pushed over years before. At first she sat in jail, unable to get out, because the amount of money required to release her while she waited was set impossibly high, at $1 million. It was later lowered to $400,000, which was still far more than she or her family could ever pay. What happened next echoes the pattern in these stories. where strangers do what the system will not. Groups that fight for people in her situation came together and raised the $400,000, paying it so she could wait for the rest of her case from outside a cell. The groups that pitched in had names built around exactly this kind of work, organizations devoted to bailing out and standing behind survivors of abuse, and the people the system tends to abandon. They said openly that once Christel's case was over, the money would be used to help others like her, seeding a fund to free more survivors held only because they were poor. In the summer of 2020, after roughly 2 years locked up, Christel walked out of jail to wait for her trial at home. Her name had become a rallying cry, much like Cintoya's, people pointing to her case as proof that the justice system was failing young black girls who had been sold and abused. Toya Brownlong herself spoke up for Christel, saying it felt like history repeating itself, one more young girl reacting to her own trauma, and being met by a system that would not listen. The real heart of her case, though, was the legal battle over that special law. Wisconsin had passed its rule years earlier, saying that victims of this kind of exploitation should not be punished for crimes that came as a direct result of it. The law was meant to be a shield. The hard question no one had ever fully answered was how big SHIELD was. Christel's lawyers wanted to use it. If it applied to her, and if they could show that what she did grew directly out of the exploitation Vola had subjected her to, she could be found not guilty entirely. It was the strongest possible protection a person in her position could hope for, and it had never been tested in a case this serious. The first answer she got was no. The trial court ruled that the law was never meant to cover the most serious kind of harm to another person. In that view, a defense built to protect victims from being punished for smaller crimes tied to their situation could not be stretched to cover the ending of a life. That ruling threatened to slam the door on her best hope before she ever got to use it. Her lawyers fought it. A higher court looked at the question and disagreed with the trial court, saying the law could indeed apply, and that she should be allowed to put her history of exploitation in front of a jury. The fight did not stop there, kept climbing, all the way to the highest court in the state, because the question was that big and that new. In the summer of 2022, Wisconsin Supreme Court gave its answer, and it was historic. By a narrow margin, with the judges split closely, the court ruled that Christel could use the law as a complete defense. Even against the most serious charge, the decision meant that if she could prove at trial that what she did was a direct result of the exploitation she had endured, she could walk free, case. Quite like it had ever reached that point anywhere. The ruling did not declare her innocent. It simply said she was allowed to make the argument, and that a jury would be allowed to clear her on that basis, for victims and the people fighting for them. Even that much was a genuine breakthrough, a sign that the law might finally be capable of seeing a girl like her clearly, instead of treating her history as something that did not matter. Her case also got pulled into a larger national conversation about fairness, especially after another Kenosha case made headlines. Kyle Rittenhouse, who had used a gun during unrest in the same city, was found not guilty after arguing he acted in self-defense. The two cases came out of the same place nearly the same time, and people could not help but set them side by side. Advocates pointed to the contrast and asked why a self-defense argument seemed to come so much more easily for some people than for a young black girl who said she was defending herself against the man who had been abusing and selling her. Christel's name was chanted alongside that comparison, case held up as an example of who the system tends to believe and who it tends to doubt, who is allowed to be afraid for their life and who is not. After all of that, after the years of fighting, and the landmark ruling that said she could argue her exploitation as a full defense, her case did not end with a dramatic trial and a jury setting her free. In 2024, Crystal made a different choice. Plead guilty to a lesser charge, the kind that describes causing a death through dangerous, reckless behaviour rather than through a cold plan. By doing so, she admitted that she had acted in a criminally reckless way when she used the gun. The deal meant she would avoid a trial and avoid the risk of a life sentence. It also meant the powerful defense she had won the right to use never actually got tested in front of a jury. The shield she had spent years fighting to lift was set down before anyone ever saw whether it would hold. The choice to plead guilty rather than fight is worth sitting with, because it explains something painful about how these cases really work. Trial is a gamble. Even with the right to argue self-defense and exploitation, Crystal would have been placing her entire future in the hands of 12 strangers, who might believe the prosecutors instead. The version where she planned a robbery and an attack and tried to cover it with a fire. If that jury sided against her, she could have spent the rest of her life in prison. Against that risk, a guaranteed sentence with a definite end can start to look like the safer bet, even to someone with a strong case. The law had finally given her a real defense, and the danger of losing was still so enormous that giving up the chance to use it felt wiser than betting everything on it. In August of 2024, she was sentenced. The judge gave her 11 years in prison, followed by 5 years of close supervision after her release. She was given credit for the time she had already spent locked up, around a year and a half. The judge did not make her eligible for any program that might have let her out early. She is expected to be released around the year 2033, so the girl who had a law on her side. A law that the state's highest court had said could free her completely, still ended up sentenced to over a decade behind bars. The shield existed. The court had agreed it could protect her, and in the end she still chose a guilty plea and years in prison over rolling the dice on a trial. The reason her case carries the weight it does, especially set against Pieper's, is what it reveals about how much can go right on paper and still fall short for the actual girl living it. Pieper, the problem was a blunt law that could not see her humanity. With Crystal, the law that mattered most was the opposite kind, thoughtful one, written specifically to protect victims like her. And a high court even ruled in her favour, and yet the outcome was still years in a cell. A protection can exist and be upheld and still not be enough, because the risk of losing at trial was so enormous that taking 11 guaranteed years felt safer than betting her whole life on 12 strangers believing her. A good law is only as strong as a frightened teenager's willingness to gamble her entire future on it. That is a terribly thin kind of protection. Her story also keeps alive the hardest question in all of this, the question of who the law decides to treat as a victim. Vola was, by the evidence the police themselves gathered, a serial predator who had been caught and released. Crystal was one of his victims, an exploited teenager. And still, the legal system spent years treating her as a potential life sentence offender first, and a victim second, while the man who had filmed himself preying on a dozen girls had been allowed to go home. The imbalance is staggering when laid out plainly. The child who ended the life of the man harming her faced the full weight of the courts. The predator, while alive, had faced almost none of it. One of them spent years fighting for a chance at freedom. The other was let out the door by the very people investigating his crimes. What runs through Crystal's case, and through every American story told so far, is a country still arguing with itself, decade after decade, about what to do with a girl who fights back against the person abusing her and ends his life. The laws shift, the rulings pile up. Sometimes a court takes a brave step forward, the way Wisconsin's highest court did. And still, girl after girl ends up paying a heavy price, in years or in money, or in a record that never washes off. The progress is real, and so is the price, and the two keep arriving together. Fight in the United States has been long, and it is far from settled. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next girl in this story did something that almost none of the others managed. Case crosses an ocean and travels back to England in the 1980s. To a teenager whose fight did more than try to bend the law in her favour, her case ended up changing the law itself, rewriting the rules for every abused woman who had come after her, so that the courts would finally have to take years of suffering into account. Section 6. Emma Humphreys. The case that changed England. Emma was born in 1967, and she grew up in Britain. Her childhood was full of harm and instability, kind that pushes a kid out into the world far too early. By the time she was 16, she was homeless and living on the streets of Nottingham, an English city, and she was being sold to men simply to survive. A 16-year-old with no home and no one to protect her was doing whatever she could to make it through each day. That is the ground her story grows out of, and it matters, because almost everything that happened next flowed from how alone and unprotected she already was. A man named Trevor Armitage came into her life during that time. He was about twice her age, a grown man in his 30s, and he was one of the men who had paid for her. Something that to a homeless teenager who had never had it must have felt like a lifeline. He offered her a place to stay. He told her he loved her. By her own account, he was the first person who had ever said those words to her, and she believed him. For a brief moment, it might have looked like rescue. The rescue turned into a cage very quickly. Armitage became the man controlling her and selling her. He subjected her to brutal harm of every kind. He controlled where she went and what she did. He watched her constantly. At one point, he nailed the windows of the home shut so that she could not escape through them. A girl who had walked in believing she had finally found someone who cared was now trapped inside, owned by a man who hurt her and would not let her leave. The horror deepened in ways that are hard to read. During this period, Emma was attacked by a group of men, an assault so devastating that afterward she could not bear to be near Armitage at all. Distress did not move him. He ignored what had happened to her and forced himself on her anyway, again and again. She was a teenager carrying fresh, unbearable trauma, and the man who claimed to love her treated her pain as an inconvenience and kept hurting her. The night everything ended was the 25th of February 1985. Emma was around 17 years old. Earlier that evening, Armitage had been cruel to her in front of others, taunting and jeering at her in a way that cut deep, mocking her over her own visible despair. Back at the home, terrified that he was about to force himself on her once more. And in the depths of distress, Emma picked up a knife and used it once. He did not survive the wound. The moment it happened, she tried to get him help. There was no cold calm in her. She was a panicked, broken teenager who had been pushed past every limit a person has. And then she immediately tried to save the man she had just struck. What happened in the courtroom afterward was a failure stacked on top of a tragedy. Emma was so traumatized that she could barely speak about what had been done to her. She could not bring herself to explain the years of abuse, the assaults, the imprisonment in that home. The lawyers who were supposed to help her did a poor job of it. They did not gently draw the truth out of her. They did not ask the right questions about what had led to that night. As a result, the full story of the harm she had survived never properly reached the people deciding her fate. Her account left out the history of abuse almost entirely. There is a legal idea that might have saved her. Understanding it is the key to her whole case. It is called provocation. In simple terms, it is the idea that if a person is pushed past their breaking point by someone else's terrible behaviour, ending a life in that state might count as a lesser crime than the most serious charge. Because the person was not acting as a calm, free chooser, but as someone driven to the edge. For Emma, provocation should have fit perfectly. She had been driven to the edge over years, but because the story of her abuse never reached the court, and because of how the law was understood at the time, that defence was rejected. In December of 1985, Emma was found guilty of the most serious charge. She was still a teenager. Because of her age, she was given the kind of open-ended sentence handed to young people, a sentence with no fixed end date, meaning she would stay locked up for as long as the authorities decided, possibly for a very long time. The years she spent in prison were dark ones. She was there for over a decade. She suffered from deep sadness and despair. Her suffering only deepened. Teenager who had already survived more pain than most people face, in a lifetime was now locked away as an offender. The truth of what had happened to her, buried under a bad trial and a misunderstanding of the law. For a long time, looked like that was simply how her story would end. The thing that changed everything was a group of women who refused to accept that ending. 2. After seeing news coverage of other women fighting similar convictions, Emma reached out to a campaign group called Justice for Women. The group had been formed by women determined to challenge the way the courts treated females who fought back against abusive men, especially when the law seemed to give understanding to violent men while punishing abused women harshly. They took up Emma's case. For roughly 3 years, they fought to get her conviction back in front of a higher court, gathering the truth that had been left out the first time and pressing for someone to finally look at it. On the 7th of July 1995, that fight paid off in dramatic fashion. A higher court, the Court of Appeal, which has the power to review and overturn the decisions of lower courts, threw out Emma's conviction on the most serious charge, replaced it with the lesser one. And because of the years she had already served, she walked free that day. Crowds of supporters were waiting outside, and they cheered as she came out. Her case was front-page news. After a decade buried under the worst label the law could give her, a teenager who had been failed at every turn finally walked into daylight as someone the courts now recognized had been pushed to her breaking point. The reason her case mattered far beyond her own freedom comes down to what the higher court decided about that idea of provocation. Before Emma, the law tended to treat provocation as a reaction to a single sudden event, a flash of rage in a single moment. That understanding worked against abused women. Because the thing that breaks a woman who has been harmed and assaulted for years is rarely one single moment. It is the slow, crushing weight of all of it, building over time. Emma's case established that provocation could build up gradually, across months and years, rather than only exploding from one instant. It supported the idea that courts had to take long-term abuse into account, including the deep and lasting harm done to a person who is hurt over and over. That change rewrote how these cases would be judged. Every abused woman in England who came after Emma and argued she had been driven to her breaking point over years, rather than in a single second owed something to the teenager whose case forced the courts to see it. The ending of Emma's own life is the part that keeps her story from being a simple triumph, and it should be told honestly and gently. After her release, she did not just disappear into a quiet life. She spent about 3 years working alongside the women who had fought for her, campaigning to help others in situations like the one she had survived. She turned her freedom into a fight for other people, but the damage done to her across so many years did not heal just because the courts had finally listened. She died in 1998, only 3 years after walking free, at the age of 30, in an accident involving the medication she had become dependent on. Prize was later created in her name, a way of keeping alive the meaning of what she had been through and what she had changed. Reason her story sits where it does, after all the American cases, is that it shows what becomes possible when a single case is fought all the way to the top, and it shows the price of that fight. In the United States, the stories so far have been a country arguing with itself over and over, bending now and then, but never quite settling the question of what to do with a girl who fights back against her abuser. Emma's case did something cleaner and more permanent. It moved the law. The rules genuinely changed because of her, and yet the girl at the centre of it did not get to enjoy that victory for long. She had been broken too thoroughly, too young, by too many people who were supposed to help her. Her case is proof that the law can be changed for the better, proof that changing the law does not undo what was done to the person who had to suffer. To change it, her story also speaks to the same tangle of victim and criminal that runs through all of these. Emma was a child failed by everyone. She was homeless at 16, sold to men, taken in by a man who promised love and delivered torment, trapped behind nailed-shut windows, harmed over and over. And the legal system's first answer to all of that was to brand her with its worst label and lock her away with no fixed end. Took years, and a group of determined strangers, for the courts to admit that the truth of her life mattered to the judgment of her actions. The victim had to fight for over a decade to be seen as anything other than the villain. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. Every girl so far, across 2 countries and several decades, shares one thing in common. Each of them acted with her own hands in the moment, facing the person who had hurt her. Cyntoia in that bedroom, Sarah in that motel, Brescia with her father's gun, Pippa with the knife by the bed, Christel in that house, Emma in that home. The next girl in this story did something that sets her apart from all of them, something that a lot of people find much harder to understand or forgive. She was an American high school cheerleader with a hidden, terrible secret at home, and rather than pick up a weapon herself, she turned to a boy in her class and asked him to do it for her. Section 7. Cheryl Pearson. From the outside, Cheryl Pearson looked like an ordinary American teenager. She was 16 years old. She was a high school cheerleader. She lived in Selden, a town on Long Island in New York, in the middle of the 1980s. She had a boyfriend and friends, and a normal-seeming life at school. But behind the front door of her family home, she was living a nightmare that almost no one around her knew about, and the way she finally escaped. It puts her apart from every other girl in this story. Cheryl did not pick up a weapon and face her abuser herself. She turned to a boy in her class and asked him to do it for her. The abuser was her own father, James Pearson. He was 42 years old and worked as an electrician. According to Cheryl, he had been abusing her since she was around 11 years old. The first time happened, she said, while he was driving her to visit her mother, who was sick and in the hospital. From there, it became a regular part of her life, year after year, hidden behind the walls of an ordinary-looking house. Her mother eventually died, and the abuse continued. Child, who had already lost one parent to illness, was being harmed by the only parent she had left. To understand why Cheryl felt as trapped as she did, the nature of that kind of abuse has to be faced honestly. Child being harmed by a parent is caught in a horror with no obvious exit. The person hurting her was also the person who fed her, housed her, and held authority over her entire life. Children in that situation very often stay silent for years, blaming themselves, terrified of breaking the family apart, frightened of what will happen if they tell. Cheryl kept the secret for years, the way so many abused children do, carrying it alone while putting on the face of a cheerful high schooler for everyone outside the home. The thing that finally pushed her toward a decision was not only her own suffering. It was fear for someone smaller than her, Frost. Cheryl had a younger sister who was around 8 years old. Cheryl became afraid that her father would turn his abuse onto the little girl next. The thought of her baby sister going through what she had endured was the weight that tipped her over, teenager, who had survived years of her own torment, now believed she was the only thing standing between that little girl and the same fate. The plan itself began in the most ordinary of places, a high school homeroom in November of 1985. Cheryl and a classmate named Sean Peaker, both around 16, were sitting together as they usually did. They got to talking about a newspaper article describing an abused wife who had arranged to have her husband harmed. In the course of that conversation, Cheryl wondered aloud who would ever be willing to do such a thing for money. Sean Peaker answered that he would. From that grim teenage exchange, a real plan took shape. Cheryl confided in Sean about what her father was doing to her. She agreed to pay him to end her father's life, settling on a sum of money. She and her boyfriend, Rob Cuccio, managed to put together part of that payment. On the morning of February 5, 1986, the plan was carried out. As James Pearson left his Long Island home for work, Sean Peaker was waiting with a gun, and James Pearson did not survive. Cheryl later came out and found her father in the driveway. The man who had abused her for years was gone, and a teenage classmate had done it in exchange for money that a 16-year-old girl had scraped together. The plot did not hold together for long. Boyfriend Rob was carrying the knowledge of what they had done, and he broke under the weight of it and told the police everything. Within about a week, all three of them, Sean Peaker, Cheryl Pearson, and Rob Cuccio, were under arrest. What had started as a desperate teenager's secret was now a criminal case splashed across the news, and it would dominate headlines for its strange and disturbing mix of cheerleaders, family abuse, and a planned act carried out for money by a kid. When the case reached the courts, the hidden truth finally came out into the open. Cheryl's lawyers revealed that she had been abused by her father over the course of years. She had moved toward having him harmed when she became convinced he was about to start preying on her 8-year-old sister. There was no physical proof of the abuse, since the kind of evidence that might document years-old harm often does not survive, but the people around the family began to speak. Neighbours and friends came forward to say they had suspected something was deeply wrong in that house and had been too afraid or too unsure to act on it. A relative testified on her behalf about knowing of the abuse. A picture emerged of a community that had sensed the horror and stayed quiet, leaving a child to carry it alone until she broke. The outcomes of the case show how the legal system tried to weigh a planned act against the years of abuse behind it. Cheryl pleaded guilty to the lesser charge, the kind used when a death is caused without it being the gravest level of intent. Punishment was strikingly light. She served only around 3 months behind bars. The judge and the system, faced with the evidence of what her father had done to her, chose mercy in her case. Sean Peaker, the boy who had actually carried it out, treated far more harshly. He pleaded guilty as well, and was sentenced to a long stretch in prison, serving around 16 years. Rob Cuccio, boyfriend who had helped arrange the payment, pleaded guilty to the crime of getting someone else to commit a crime, and he was given probation rather than prison time. The lives that came afterward took unexpected turns. Sean Peaker eventually came out of prison and went on to run a program devoted to helping former prisoners get an education and rebuild their lives. A boy who had done something so dark as a teenager spent his adulthood trying to lift other people out of the system that had held him. Cheryl, for her part, married her boyfriend Rob not long after her release. They built a family together and had 2 daughters. She took a new last name and lived a quiet life for decades before eventually speaking publicly about what had happened, even writing a book about it, Teenagers. At the center of one of the most shocking cases of the 1980s, grew into adults carrying it with them in very different ways. The reason Cheryl's case sits apart from every other girl in this story, and the reason it is genuinely harder for many people to make peace with, comes down to one fact that has to be stated plainly. This was a planned act, not self-defense in a sudden moment. James Pearson was not attacking his daughter when he died. He was walking out his front door on his way to work. It was arranged weeks in advance, paid for, and carried out by someone else while Cheryl was elsewhere. Every other girl so far faced her abuser directly, in a moment of fear, acted with her own hands. Cheryl reached out across a distance through a hired classmate and had it done. That difference is not small, changes how the act can honestly be judged. Holding the full truth of her case means holding 2 hard things at once. On one side, Cheryl did was a calculated arrangement to end a man's life, and the law treated it as a crime, which is why she and the others pleaded guilty, rather than walking away clean. Planned act against a person who is not in the middle of attacking you is one of the hardest things to defend, no matter how monstrous that person was. On the other side, the abuse she described was widely believed, reported by neighbours and a relative, and the broad sense of the community, Post, and the system responded to that belief by giving her a remarkably light punishment. 3 months for a planned act tells you how seriously the people deciding her fate took the years of abuse behind it. Both of those truths are real. A teenager arranged a man's death, and a teenager had been so thoroughly abused by that man that the courts could not bring themselves to treat her like an ordinary offender. Her case also stretches the central question of this story into new and uncomfortable shape. The girls who acted in self-defense. It is at least possible to imagine the law eventually recognizing a frightened child fighting for her life. Cheryl makes the question harder. She was a victim, by every indication a deeply harmed one, abused for years, and driven by terror for her little sister. And she also did something the law cannot simply wave away, which is to plan and pay for a death. The fact that the system still chose to be gentle with her says something important about how the weight of long-term child abuse can change the way even a planned act is understood. It does not erase what was done. It reframes how much blame a person truly carries for it. There is a thread connecting Cheryl back to the very first girls in this story, even across the gap between self-defense and a planned act. Like Cyntoia and Sarah and the others, Cheryl was a child failed by the adults around her. People suspected the abuse and stayed silent. The one parent left to protect her was the one harming her. By the time she acted, she had already spent years with no rescue coming. The shapes of these cases differ, but the whole at the centre of each of them is the same, an absence where the protection of a child should have been. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next girl ended the life of an abusive father too, much like Cheryl did. Her path ran in almost the opposite direction. She did not arrange anything from a distance. And she did not hire anyone. She did it with her own hands. And when her case reached the courts, instead of mercy arriving quickly, something colder happened. People deciding her fate refused to let the jury even hear about the years of abuse she had suffered. And because of that, she would end up waiting nearly 2 decades for anyone with the power to free her to finally show her any mercy at all. Section 8. Stacey Lannert. The long wait for mercy. Stacey Lannert's story takes place in Missouri, near the city of St. Louis. The man whose life she took was her father, Thomas Lannert. According to Stacey, he had been abusing her since she was 8 years old. 8. By the time she was older, the abuse had become a routine part of her life, and he had threatened to end her life if she ever told anyone what he was doing. So her entire childhood, from the time she was a small girl, had been shaped and poisoned by the man who was supposed to be her protector. When people picture a happy family upbringing, they imagine the opposite of what Stacey actually lived through every year of her young life. One detail about Stacey sets her apart from most of the other girls in this story, and honesty requires putting it right up front. When she ended her father's life on the 4th of July in 1990, she was 18 years old. That makes her, by the law's reckoning, legal adult rather than a child, and the oldest of all the girls covered here. At the same time, 18 is still a teenager, barely out of childhood, and the abuse that drove her to that night had been running since she was 8 years old. The person who acted at 18 had been formed by a decade of torment that began when she was a tiny girl. Her age at the moment does not erase the childhood that led her there. The path to that night was darker and more tangled than a simple act of self-defense, and the full truth has to be told. Stacey came to fear that her father was turning his abuse toward her younger sister, the same terror that had pushed Cheryl Pearson to act. Stacey and her sister had arranged to have their father harmed, and money had been paid towards someone hired to do it. When that hired person never showed up, Stacey took a gun and acted herself while her father slept. Her sister was later convicted for her part in the plan, so this was not purely a girl grabbing a weapon in a single panicked instant. There had been planning behind it, and that planning is part of what makes her case genuinely complicated, rather than clean. When Stacey went to trial in 1992, the legal system made a choice that many people still find hard to stomach. The court would not allow the years of abuse to function as a real defense. The jury was not permitted to treat what her father had done to her since she was 8 as something that could excuse or lessen what she did. Deep, lasting damage that years of abuse leaves on a person. The kind of harm that other courts in other places would later come to recognize, kept from doing any real work in her case. Missouri at that time did not accept that kind of long-term abuse as a legal reason that could change the verdict. So the jury was steered toward judging the act itself, while being blocked from fully reckoning with the lifetime of horror behind it. There is a detail about the lead-up to her trial that says a great deal about who Stacey was. Before the trial, she was offered a deal that would have given her a far shorter sentence, around 15 years. She turned it down. The reason she refused is striking. The deal would have required her to stand up in court and declare out loud that she had acted for her father's money. Stacey would not say that because it was not true. She refused to put a lie about her own motive on the record in exchange for a lighter punishment. Teenager, facing the possibility of life in prison, chose the truth over the easier path. And that choice would cost her dearly. Cost came in the form of the harshest possible sentence. Stacey was convicted of the most serious charge, the planned and intentional kind, and she was sentenced to life in prison with no possibility of ever being released. The same crushing sentence that had been handed to Sarah Cruzen was now handed to her. An 18-year-old who had been abused since she was 8 was told she would spend the rest of her life behind bars. Something happened after the sentence that revealed just how uneasy people were with it. Members of the jury spoke up afterward, expressing real distress that the facts of the abuse had not been laid before them in a way they could properly weigh. Even the judge made a statement, suggesting the sentence felt awfully severe for someone so young, given the evidence of abuse that existed. The discomfort was right there among the very people who had been part of convicting her. They sensed that something had gone wrong, true and terrible context had been kept out of the room, and that a young woman had been buried under a sentence that did not fit the whole of her story. Stacey did what people in her position do. She appealed, asking higher courts to look again at how her trial had been handled. The higher courts declined to overturn it. They would not override Missouri's rules about what the jury had been allowed to consider, and they would not force the state to accept the kind of abuse-based defense that might have changed everything. The doors closed one after another, so the years began to pile up. 1 year, then 5, then 10. A young woman who had entered prison as a teenager grew into a grown adult inside its walls, while the world outside moved on without her. The wait stretched to 18 years. 18 years is longer than the entire childhood that her father had spent abusing her. It is enough time for a person to lose most of their youth entirely. Through all of it, the original wrong at the heart of her case, refusal to let the abuse count, sat unaddressed, while Stacey simply endured, day after day, a sentence built to never end. Mercy finally arrived in January of 2009, and it came from an unexpected place at an unexpected time. The governor of Missouri, Matt Blunt, on his way out of office. In his final days in the job, after what he described as a thorough review of the evidence, he concluded that Stacey had indeed suffered extensive abuse at her father's hands. He used his power to cut her sentence down, changing it from life with no exit to a length that made her eligible for immediate release. He did the same for another woman whose case bore similar marks. Within days, Stacey walked out of prison, free for the first time in 18 years. Years later, in 2018, another Missouri governor went a step further and granted her a full pardon, officially clearing the conviction from her record entirely. What Stacey did with the freedom she had waited so long for is the part of her story turns it towards something better. She did not vanish into a quiet, hidden life. She wrote a book about what she had survived. She told her story on national television. She founded a support group aimed at helping other people who had lived through abuse, especially other women. And she went further than almost anyone might expect. She went back to school, earned a college degree, and then went to law school. She became a public defender, which is a lawyer the government provides to people who cannot afford one of their own. Teenager who had once sat in a courtroom while the truth of her life was kept from the jury, grew into a woman who stood in courtrooms to defend people who could not defend themselves. The transformation is remarkable, and it is real. The reason her case lands so hard, set right after Cheryl's, is the brutal contrast between them. Both girls ended the life of an abusive father. Both had reason to fear for a younger sister. Both cases involved planning rather than a single sudden moment, and yet Cheryl walked free in about 3 months, while Stacey waited 18 years. The difference did not come from one being a worse person than the other. It came from the choices the legal systems around them made, from whether the abuse was allowed to matter, from the particular state and the particular laws and the particular people deciding. 2 girls with painfully similar stories received punishments separated by nearly 2 decades, That gap is a window into how uneven and arbitrary justice can be for a girl who fights back against her abuser, depending on nothing more than where she happens to stand, and who happens to be judging her. Her case also carries the same hard knot that runs through this whole story. Stacy was, by the eventual judgment of a governor and the unease of her own jury, a genuine victim of years of childhood abuse. She was also a person who took part in planning and then acted herself against a sleeping man. Both of those are true. Real victim did a serious and calculated thing, and the law treated it as the gravest kind of charge, false. And only after 18 years did the system reach back and acknowledge that the abuse should have counted for far more than it had. Recognition came late, but it came, and it was followed by a clean record and a new life built on helping others. Every girl in this story so far has lived inside one country or another, whose legal systems, for all their cruelty and all their failures, never tried to take her life as punishment for what she did. Cyntoia and Sarah faced sentences meant to keep them locked away forever, but not to lose their lives. Brescia and Pieper and Chris faced prison. Emma faced an open-ended sentence. Stacy faced 18 years and a refusal to hear her truth. None of them faced the loss of their own life as a penalty. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The next girl in this story did. Her case leaves the United States entirely and travels to Sudan in northeastern Africa, where a teenager was forced into a marriage she never agreed to and ended the life of the husband who assaulted her. The punishment a court reached for, in her case, was not a prison sentence at all. It was the loss of her own life. Section 9. Noura Hussein. The bride who said, "Every girl so far lived in a country where the worst the law could do to her was lock her away." Noura Hussein faced something more final. In Sudan, a country in the northeast of Africa, a teenager who ended the life of the husband forced upon her was sentenced not to prison, but to lose her own life. Her case became a storm that swept across the entire world, and the fight over whether a girl could be condemned to die for resisting a marriage she never wanted forced people everywhere to look at how some places still treat young women as property to be handed off and used. Noura's ordeal began when she was 16 years old. Her father arranged for her to be married to a man named Abdul Rahan, who was around 35 years old. Noura did not choose this marriage. She did not want it. In Sudan at that time, the law allowed children to be married off at shockingly young ages, with the legal age of marriage set as low as 10 years old. 16-year-old, being signed over to a grown man through an agreement made between that man and her father, was not treated as strange or wrong there. It was treated as normal. A child was being handed to an adult, and the paperwork made it official. Noura fought against it from the very start. When the marriage was first arranged, she ran. She fled to a relative's home in another part of the country and stayed there for about 3 years, refusing to go through with becoming this man's wife. For 3 years, a teenager managed to keep herself out of a marriage that the adults in her life were trying to force on her. That kind of resistance, sustained over years by a young girl with little power, shows how desperately she did not want this life. Her own father is the one who finally trapped her. He tricked her into coming back, telling her a lie, leading her to believe the marriage had been called off. Once she returned, the truth was waiting. The marriage was not off at all. Todd. In the spring of 2017, after she had finished high school, she was forced to move into her husband's home and to become his wife in the eyes of everyone around her. The girl who had escaped for 3 years was now living under the roof of a man she had never agreed to marry. Even then, Noura refused to be a wife to him in the way he demanded. She would not let him near her in that way. For several days she held him off. Then her husband decided he would take by force what she would not give. With the help of 3 of his male relatives who physically held her down, he forced himself on her. The very people who should have been horrified instead helped him commit the assault. A young woman was pinned by a group of men so that her husband could assault her. In the home she had been forced into, by the family she had been forced to join. The next morning, he tried to force himself on her again. This time in the struggle, Nora reached for a knife from the kitchen, and in the fight that followed she used it. The wounds were fatal and he died. After it happened, she fled to her own family's home, looking for safety from the people who were supposed to be hers. And her father, the same man who had tricked her back into the marriage, handed her over to the police. The family that had forced her into the marriage now delivered her to be punished for surviving it. When Noura's case reached the Sudanese courts, the deck was stacked against her in a way that is hard for many people to imagine. The law there did not recognize the idea that a husband could assault his wife in that way. In the eyes of that legal system, forcing himself on the woman he had married was not a crime at all, so the assault that driven Noura to fight for herself counted for almost nothing in court. The forced marriage counted for almost nothing. What the court saw was a wife who had ended her husband's life, and it treated that as a plain, deliberate act. She was found guilty. Then came the sentence, and it was the harshest one a court can hand down. In May of 2018, Noura was condemned to lose her own life. Under the system there, the family of the person who had died held a great deal of power over what happened next. They could choose to accept a payment of money and spare her, or they could demand that her life be taken in return. Noura's husband's family rejected any payment. They demanded her life. So a teenager who had been forced into marriage as a child and assaulted by the man chosen for her was now scheduled to lose her own life, with the man's relatives insisting on it. Reaction around the world was enormous and immediate. The United Nations spoke out. Major human rights organizations condemned the sentence and called for it to be thrown out. Campaign demanding justice for Noura spread across the internet, and a global petition gathered more than 1 million signatures from people in country after country. Famous figures lent their voices to the cause. People who had never heard of Sudan's marriage laws were suddenly learning them. They were horrified. The case had become a symbol of everything wrong with forcing children into marriage, and then refusing to acknowledge the harm that follows. The pressure on Sudan's authorities grew and grew. That pressure made a difference, much as it had for Cyntoia Brown on the other side of the planet. In June of 2018, a higher court stepped in and overturned the sentence. Noura's life would not be taken. In its place, the court gave her a prison sentence of 5 years, counted from the time of her arrest, but the court attached a heavy condition. Her family was ordered to pay a large sum of money to the dead husband's family, the kind of payment known as blood money, amounting to the equivalent of many thousands of dollars. So Noura escaped the worst, and in exchange, her family was made to hand over a fortune to the relatives of the man who had assaulted her. The echo of Pippa Lewis being ordered to pay her abuser's family rings loudly here, except for Noura. The alternative had been the loss of her own life. The reason Noura's case matters so much, and why it belongs near the end of this story, is what it reveals about how far some legal systems are from seeing girls like her as human beings' rights. In her country, a child could be legally married to a grown man. That man could assault her with help, and the law would not call it a crime. And when she fought back to protect herself, that same law would reach for the harshest possible punishment. Part of the system was arranged against her. The marriage was forced on her, as a child. The harm was ignored. Punishment for resisting was the loss of her life. Only the eyes of the entire world, watching and shouting, pulled her back from the edge. Honesty about her case means being clear on a few things, the same way it has mattered for every girl here. Noura was 19 years old at the time, which makes her a teenager but one of the older ones, and a legal adult by most reckonings. At the same time, the trap that led to that moment had been built around her when she was a child of 16, through a marriage she never agreed to. What happened itself took place in a struggle while her husband was trying to force himself on her again, which places it closer to a desperate act of self-protection than to a planned one. And still, the court treated it as a deliberate act and aimed for the harshest punishment, refusing to weigh the assault or the forced marriage as anything that mattered. The facts of her case make that sentence look monstrous. That is exactly why the world reacted the way it did. Her case also drags the central question of this story onto a global stage. In the United States and in England, the failures were real, but the systems at least had room, eventually, to recognise abuse, to reduce a sentence, to change a law, to grant mercy. In Noura's case, the failure was built into the foundation. The law itself declared that her abuse was not abuse. There was no quiet recognition waiting to be drawn out, no defence about long-term suffering that a clever lawyer could raise. The only thing standing between Noura and the loss of her life was the noise of millions of strangers refusing to let it happen. That is a terrifying thought, because it means her survival depended not on justice working, but on the whole world happening to be watching at the right moment. There is a thread tying Noura back to nearly every girl who came before her, Brescia and Cheryl and Stacy. She was failed first and most deeply by her own family. The people who were supposed to protect her, father arranged the marriage, tricked her back into it, and then handed her to the police. Like Cyntoia and Sarah and the others, she was treated by the law as a criminal first and a victim a distant second or not at all. And like several of them, her freedom, when it came, price tag attached, paid out to the family of the very man who had harmed her. The settings change, the laws change, the languages change. The same brutal pattern keeps repeating across continents. Before we move on, if you're enjoying this analysis, please consider subscribing. It helps the channel tremendously. The final girl in this story stays in the same part of the world, in Iran, and her case also begins with a teenager condemned to lose her life. But hers stands apart from every single case told so far, and it offers something none of the others quite managed to. The man whose life she took was not a husband forced upon her, not an abusive father, not a man who had sold her for years. He was a stranger who attacked her in a park, and in the end, hers would become the one case where a court looked directly at a girl in her position and said, plainly and clearly, that she had done nothing more than defend herself. Section 10. Nazanin Fateh. The night in the park. Nazanin was 17 years old. The night that changed her life took place in March of 2005 in a park in Karaj, a city not far from Tehran, the capital of Iran. She was there with her young niece, who was around 15 or 16, and with two young men. The setting was ordinary, few teenagers spending time in a park. Then 3 men approached them and began harassing the group. What started as harassment quickly turned into something far more dangerous. The 2 young men, who were with Nazanin and her niece, ran away. That left the 2 girls alone, with 3 grown men who meant them harm. The men pushed Nazanin and her niece to the ground and tried to force themselves on them. A 17-year-old and a girl even younger were pinned in a public park by 3 attackers, with the people who had been with them gone and no help in sight. In that moment, Nazanin made the choice that would define the rest of her life. She pulled out a knife and used it to fight the attackers off, protecting herself and the younger girl. One of the men did not survive. What Nazanin did immediately afterward says everything about the kind of person she was and the kind of act this had been. She did not run. She did not hide the weapon. She gave the knife to the police right there at the scene, and she told them exactly what had happened. She told them she had used it to defend herself and her niece from being assaulted. There was no attempt to cover anything up, no story invented to protect herself. A frightened teenager handed over the truth along with the knife, trusting that the truth would matter. Truth did not matter at first. Despite her account, despite the fact that 3 men had attacked 2 girls in a park, the court that heard her case did something almost impossible to believe. In early 2006, Nazanin was convicted and condemned to lose her own life. Iran's laws allowed even young people, including minors, to face that punishment. So a 17-year-old who had fought off her attackers and then told the police the plain truth found herself sentenced to die for it. The girl who had protected a child from being assaulted was now the one scheduled to lose her life. The wrongness of that sentence is staggering when laid out simply. A teenager was attacked. She defended herself and a younger girl. She turned herself in and told the truth. And the response of the legal system was to condemn her to lose her life. Of all the cases in this story, hers may be the clearest example of a girl doing exactly what a person is supposed to be allowed to do when someone tries to assault them, and being condemned for it anyway. If self-defense means anything at all, it should have meant something here. Court's first answer was the harshest one it had. What saved Nazanin was the same force that saved Cyntoia and Noura, the attention of the wider world. Her case was taken up by a Canadian-Iranian activist who, by coincidence, shared her first name, woman named Nazanin Afshinjam. This activist launched a campaign to save the teenager's life. She created a petition that gathered hundreds of thousands of signatures from people around the globe. She spoke to political leaders and to international organizations. She helped bring attention to the case through a documentary. What had been a quiet sentence in a court near Tehran became a story that people across many countries were following and protesting. Once again, strangers far away refused to let a girl be destroyed without a fight. That pressure produced a result. On the 1st of June 2006, the most senior official in charge of Iran's court system stepped in and halted the sentence. He ordered that her case be tried again. Punishment was paused, and Nazanin would get a second chance at having her story properly heard. For a girl who had been told she would lose her life, that pause was the difference between life and death. The second trial is where Nazanin's case became unique among all the others. It took place in early 2007, with several judges reviewing what had happened in that park. This time, the judges looked closely at the accounts given by the men involved, and they found that those accounts did not hold together. They saw inconsistencies, places where the stories did not match or make sense. After weighing it all, the judges agreed, unanimously, that there had been no planned, intentional act. They determined that what Nazanin had done was self-defense. They cleared her of the most serious charge. In all the cases told here, across decades and continents, this is the one time a court took a long, careful look at a girl in her position and concluded out loud that she had simply been defending herself. Recognition that had been denied to so many of the others was, at last, given to her. Even this victory was not entirely clean. Honesty requires noting the catch. While the judges agreed it was self-defense, some of them ruled that Nazanin had used more force than was necessary to protect herself. and on that basis they ordered her family to pay blood money to the dead man's family. The same kind of payment that had hung over Nora's case. The Fatehi family was poor and could not afford it. So, in a now familiar pattern, people from around the world contributed money, and the payment was eventually made. After more than 2 years spent in jail, Nazanin was released on bail in early 2007. A teenager who had been sentenced to lose her life walked out into freedom, cleared of the most serious charge, her life no longer in danger. The years after her release took a quieter and sadder shape. Nazanin stepped out of the public eye. Cameras and campaigns that had surrounded her case moved on. Some years later, the supporters who had fought so hard to save her reported that they had lost track of her, that her whereabouts were unknown to them. The girl whose name had been on petitions signed by hundreds of thousands of people slipped back into ordinary, untracked life, perhaps into hardship that no one outside could see. Her case ended in the closest thing to justice found anywhere in this story, and yet the person at the centre of it largely disappeared from view afterward. The reason Nazanin's case is the right one to end on comes down to what makes it different from every story before it. Hers is the purest example of self-defense in the entire collection. The man whose life she took was not a husband forced upon her, not a father who had abused her since childhood, not a man who had sold her for years. He was a stranger, attacking her in a public place, in the very moment she fought back. There was no long history to untangle, no question of planning, no relationship that complicated the picture. A man tried to assault a teenager and a child, and the teenager stopped him. If any case in this story should have been simple for the law to handle correctly, it was this one, Horst, and even this one began with the harshest sentence a court can give, and ended with a payment to the attacker's family. Even the clearest case of a girl protecting herself nearly ended with the loss of her own life. That fact carries both the hope and the warning that run through all of these stories. The hope is real. A court did, in the end, look at Nazanin and see the truth. Self-defense was recognized. A girl who had been condemned was cleared. It can happen. Warning sits right beside it. If a case this clear, a teenager fighting off strangers in a park and immediately telling the truth could still be met first with the harshest sentence a court has, then it shows how steep the climb is for every girl whose situation is murkier, whose abuser was someone she knew, whose story takes longer to explain. The system did not arrive at the right answer on its own. It had to be pushed there by the whole world watching. And even then, it attached a price. Nazanin's case shares its deepest thread with all the others. The same thread that has appeared in every section. She was failed by the people and the systems that should have protected her. The young men who were with her ran. The court that first heard her case condemned her. And the recognition she deserved came late. Only after enormous outside pressure came with strings attached. The settings have changed across these 10 stories, from American drive-ins and motels to family homes, from English streets to a Sudanese e-marriage to an Iranian park. The languages and the laws and the decades have all been different. The shape of what happened to these girls has stayed hauntingly the same. 10 girls now sit at the centre of this story. Cyntoia and Sarah, sold by men who pretended to care. Brescia, 14 years old, afraid of the father in her own home. Pieper, handed a bill for surviving. Christul, with a law on her side that still could not fully save her. Emma, whose fight changed the rules in England. Cheryl, who reached out to a classmate in the dark. Stacy, who waited 18 years for mercy. Nora, pulled back from the edge by a watching world. Nazanin, the one girl a court finally agreed had only been defending herself. They lived in different countries and different decades. They faced different abusers and met different endings. Set side by side, 10 of them stop being separate news stories and start to look like a single, repeating picture, one that has something to say about all of us and the way the world treats girls who are pushed to the edge and then fight back. That picture, and what it demands we finally understand, is what remains to be faced. If you enjoyed this breakdown, make sure to subscribe. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.